What can we learn from one of the worst novels written by one of the greatest writers to ever live? Life for Sale has long been considered one of Mishima's minor works and has often been called one of the worst, if not the worst novel that the Japanese writer has ever written. To put this into perspective, the English translation of the novel wasn't released until a little over 50 years after its original publication. We didn't get it in English until 3 years ago, 2019, despite the book coming out in 1968, I believe. What's really surprising about this is that Mishima has an almost undisputed place in the Western canon, at least as one of the greatest writers that's ever lived. I mean, he was nominated for 3 Nobel Prizes, and despite all of the craziness that happened in his personal life, really nobody questions his greatness as a writer. Now, before diving too deeply into this review, there are 2 things that I have to admit. One is that this is my first encounter with any of Mishima's written works, and 2 is that the subject matter and some of the things that happen in this book are deeply personal to me, and I think it'd be impossible to formulate any meaningful opinions or have any meaningful discussions without disclosing that up front. The biggest reason for starting my journey with Mishima, with this text in particular, is highly intentional, honestly. I like to start with a new writer from one of their works that maybe isn't as popular or is even criticized heavily, because I think that you can provide a new perspective onto that work if you haven't read all of the great works. I think that the minor works, or the ones that people widely consider to be bad, often are bad because of what preceded them or what came after them, and maybe they're not as bad, or at least they're different when they're viewed in a vacuum of just themselves. And speaking a little bit about my personal experiences, I've worked on and off as a copywriter for most of my adult life. And I've spent a lot of time in some of the world's busiest and most work-obsessed cities. So Chicago, Toronto, Bangkok, and even Tokyo at times. And so a lot of the satire that Mishima makes about life and kind of the meaninglessness of it, I kind of understand because I've seen and I've lived that firsthand. Because the work obsession in the big cities, such as Tokyo, is much different than the work obsession in more rural environments. And it's because of this that a lot of the satire that Mishima throws down throughout the text really hits home with me, and I quite enjoy it. Sure, it's absurd, it's crazy, and honestly it's a little bit stupid at times, yet it's highly enjoyable. I found myself laughing out loud and deeply enjoying this book cover to cover. And so the core question that Mishima grapples with throughout the entirety of this book is, perhaps unsurprisingly, the question of life, and specifically, what is the meaning of it? And so the ad that Hanyo puts up in the newspaper brilliantly describes all of this. Life for sale. Use me as you wish. 27-year-old male. Discretion guaranteed. Will cause no bother at all. And honestly, I think that that one sentence or that one advertisement that he puts in the newspaper is everything that you need to know to interact with this book in a meaningful way. Every paragraph, every interaction, every absurd little vignette that Mishima includes is all pointing to answering or modifying that question in all kinds of different ways. And I think that while it might not be the best work that he did that grapples with these themes, because what I've heard about Mishima is that these themes are very common throughout his body of work, I don't think they have to be the best to be worthwhile. So as Hanyo goes through the process of trying to sell his life, so to speak, and eventually die, he runs into all kinds of crazy characters, ranging from having an affair with an exceptionally beautiful woman that's connected to some Asian drug smuggling organization, to another affair with a vampire, and then even later when he meets an aristocrat with a penchant for the Shinjuku nightlife. All of these things sound so strange, and they are, but they're not really the point of the book. Like, they'll make you laugh and they'll make you think at times, but as you read, by the time you've turned the next page, you're on to the next thing, you're on to the next absurdist event, and honestly they don't matter that much, and I think that that's kind of where the brilliance of this short novel comes. While reading, you, or at least I, kind of gloss past these oddities, and you forget they happen as you kind of delve deeper and you start to deal with these themes that Mishima is getting at. You really start to focus on the why of what Hanyo is doing rather than the specifics of the what, or if it's practical or not. The text makes you question your own existence in a light-hearted, whimsical, almost playful way, and I think that's brilliant, and not very many books can do that. While reading, I began to ask myself questions like, what is the purpose of my life? But more specifically, why do I value my life? And to what extent does this value go? Am I willing to fight to live, or am I simply willing to fight to not die? And I think that the difference, while it seems small in that, is very significant. And this is the question that we're really confronted with at the book's conclusion. Hanyo, finally having been caught by the drug smugglers who are absolutely sure that he committed a crime that we know as the reader he didn't commit. They think he's a spy, and he's not at all. But that's totally irrelevant, honestly. The stakes of whether he lives or dies doesn't really matter. All that you care about is what's going on in his head, and what's he thinking, and is he okay with dying, or does he actually want to fight to live, or does he just want to fight to not die in a way that he hasn't planned? And so going to page 171 of the text, there's this brief little passage that I think really sums up this theme well. The moment he put out that life for sale ad, talking about Hanyo, he had already sealed his own fate, a violent death. No getting away from it. This unadulterated, raw realization cut through him like searing heartburn, and yet, to his surprise, the fear he'd felt while on the run had suddenly receded. What exactly was the fear of death? All the time Hanyo had felt pursued by death, his eyes were etched with nothing but fear, no matter how many times he tried to look away. Fear had been like a strange black chimney rising high up on the horizon, but now that chimney had disappeared from sight. So Hanyo begins to resist around this point of the book, and I think that desire for control usurping his desire to die, or at least his desire to not live, is the whole point. And I think that Mishima's writing and his life were questioning and grappling these ideas, and ultimately I don't think he ever came to a conclusion. I think that's why, or at least one of the reasons why, things ended how they did for him. Additionally, on that page that I just read from, we begin to get a little taste of another one of the major themes of Mishima's life. And that is this idea of distaste towards Japan becoming more westernized, right? When we hear foreigners being spoken about in the book, specifically Western foreigners, they're not spoken about in the best way. Now, he's not overtly xenophobic or racist or anything like that, not at all. But he says little things to where you can tell that he maybe wants a separation between the two. So going back to that page near the bottom, he's describing the scene of when Hanyo realizes that his captor is a Westerner. And so he says, Hanyo could tell from the hairy knuckles that the man was a foreigner. He was also aware of the body odor emanating through his clothes, a gaseous smell, redolent of chives, but somehow powerfully sweet. It could only belong to a Westerner. And so we have this idea of there being a distinct smell that is associated with Westerners, that is different than that of the Japanese people that are around, or even the other members of various Asian diaspora. I think that's super interesting, along with like the hairy knuckles, almost equating the Westerners to apish, or maybe their ideas as being apish. We see this also earlier in the book when we're at the library, and there's the foreigner who may or may not be a spy, who is speaking with almost perfect Japanese, and all the people are just really lauding him, and the praise that he gets for his perfect Japanese is so over the top that it's almost impossible to read it as anything other than Mishima kind of criticizing that idea of people from an Asian culture putting the West on a pedestal, whether it be on a one-to-one individual level or through their ideas. And I think that you can really feel his resistance to Japan becoming too westernized. I think he very much wanted Japan to be its own thing and to embrace its history, and I think that what he chose to do to end his life, I think, kind of proves that a lot. And so these are the things that for me were the most interesting to think about and really chew on while I was reading the book, and even after it, even today. And these are why I would honestly recommend picking up Life for Sale and giving it a read, whether you're a fan of Mishima or not. I think that the book has value either way. And while you read it, think about your place in society. Are you a foreigner? Are you an insider, an outsider? Are you in the West, the East? Think about your position, your place, and how that fits in with the world around you. Think about how you feel about that. And most importantly, think about what you're fighting for. Are you fighting to live, or are you simply fighting not to die?